Welcome to the Wall Street Lab podcast, where we interview top financial professionals and deconstruct their practices to give you an insider look into the world of finance.
The growth platform is really focused on backing companies to accelerate the transition to a sustainable economy. So if you think about where we focus our time and energy, it's really three often overlapping pillars, and those would be around planetary health, people health, and financial inclusion. And again, this addresses a broad set of the sustainable development goals that I was just talking about. But in planetary health, this would include low or zero carbon solutions, transforming mobility, transforming food, energy, enterprise. Under people health, this would be driving better health outcomes and a lower cost, more affordable healthcare system. And then within financial inclusion, this is supporting access to finance and a more equitable future of work. So effectively, these are, for us, the pillars of our hunting ground or where we spend our time. And given that we think we're in this systemic and secular transition to a more sustainable economy, we think this broadly fits within the mandate of kind of the sustainability revolution that we're ultimately backing.
If we start at the very top of your investment process, I checked and you have those research roadmaps. Is this basically how you then dive deeper into the focus areas that you just said?
Yeah. So roadmaps for us are the engine of our kind of sourcing and origination. So think of us as having an investment process that puts research up front. We call them roadmaps, and these are effectively market maps that help us understand how a sector is evolving and ultimately where in the value chain we're most interested in spending our time. And then what are the companies that we want to build relationships with? And ultimately that should convert into portfolio companies over time. Roadmaps, I think at the firm level, we've done around 270 of them, or maybe even more than 270 of them. And then in the growth team, we've probably delivered 120 of them. And so these would be sometimes iterative, and they can take weeks up to months and reviewed over years as a way to kind of look up and down the value chain. Again, talk to the incumbents, talk to the innovators and the disruptors, talk to the policymakers, talk to the academics, talk to the NGOs, and get a surround sound of kind of ultimately where we would like to spend our time within a value chain. And once we've identified the pocket of the value chain we want to dig into, we'll really look at the asset by asset level. So kind of which companies, are most exciting from a kind of defensible value perspective, and kind of reach out and try to get to know them, hopefully over time, and then ultimately hoping that will lead us to ability to convert them into our portfolio. So I can give some examples of these roadmaps. I think it won't surprise you that we'll have multiple layers of them in some of the core areas. If you take sustainable food systems, this is an area that we've been looking at as a firm since the beginning. And then in the growth team, 10 plus years, we will have done roadmaps on precision agriculture, on data insights for agriculture, environmental intelligence. We'll be looking at kind of some of the food innovation, food tech improvements. We'll look at alternative proteins. Actually, I think we're on our third alternative protein roadmap, where we started looking at this space and the adoption of plant-based foods and other kind of non-animal proteins in 2015. We did another recast in 2017, and then just recently a third of those roadmaps to look at shifts in market and ultimately, again, where value will reside. So this is a pretty exciting part of who we are and what we do. It's one of the reasons I think that people love working at Generation, because it has that kind of research first. And again, this is a broad set of sectors we'll look at. Recently, we've reviewed restaurant software and commercial food waste, which was the second one of that ilk. We've also looked at personalized medicine. We've looked at asset and facilities management. We've looked at many iterations of building intelligence, many iterations of the industrial efficiency and IoT, and so on. There's so many examples that we could bring to life, but that just gives a flavor of how we start our prospecting.
Then how do you go from one of those roadmaps to the fund focuses that you have? Do you fit each of the roadmap into one of the three categories, or do the categories change over time with the roadmap? So do you say for your newest fund, you focus on those three areas because you see the most need or the biggest potential here, and then maybe for another fund, you focus on different areas?
Roadmaps for us, we debate which ones we want to tackle in a year. So assume that we do about a dozen of them a year. And again, these are research pieces that our team gets allocated to, and ultimately we're doing them so that we can find names of companies that we can build relationships with and ultimately hopefully convert them into portfolio. So we have to compete them on the criteria of both relevant to find the right type of business models, and then mature enough of an area that it's not just one asset that we could chase, right? We hope that each of these roadmaps we could find somewhere between 4 to 6 highly qualified companies that could potentially make it into our portfolio. To your question around, do we force them into the pillars? No. I think if you go take a step back and look at planetary health, people health, and financial inclusion, there's a lot of space to cover. And while we have this kind of library of knowledge that we've built up over time on mobility, on energy systems, on food systems, on industrial systems, on increasingly healthcare systems, on financial services. There's so many elements that we actually have to be choosy and at the beginning of each year force rank where our team's going to spend time for roadmaps. Ultimately, we think that our most precious asset is our time. And so we want to put it to the place that will get the highest productivity. And that slate then of a dozen or so becomes our marching orders throughout the year. And of course, it can shift. So in a time of COVID-19 and disruption into everything from how healthcare is delivered, how supply chains are operating, it encourages us to recast our most recent roadmap on supply chain and understanding in light of this pandemic, what does it mean? But like beneficially, we've done 10 years on supply chain and logistics. So it's not that we're starting fresh to say, oh my gosh, what does this current health crisis mean? It's actually quite nuanced to say what pockets of opportunity could actually accelerate now because of the situation that we're in. I think there's so many examples of a roadmap coverage area which is a trend we cite and that develops over time, or the trend materializes over time, and we then gain conviction. I think future of work, distributed workforce collaboration is a roadmap that we debated, discussed, and prioritized back in 2015. It led to an investment in a company called Asana that helps enable remote workforces through collaboration tools. And that is only more relevant today and perhaps even accelerating today because of the requirement for more virtual interactions. So that's sort of the benefit of having done the work up front, is that you can then iterate and then move quickly when you see trends really accelerate.
Disclaimer. Information contained in this podcast constitutes the opinions of individuals and should not be treated as investment, tax, financial, or legal advice. We take no responsibility for the accuracy of any statements made in this podcast. This podcast is for informational and educational purposes only, and it does not contain an offer to sell or buy any sort of financial products, and should not be treated as advertisement for such. Any copying, distribution, or reproduction of this podcast without the prior permission of the creators of the podcast is strictly prohibited.